My name is Shadow. Since you were so kind to release me, my master, I will grant you one wish.
What if I told you Shadow isn't as edgy in Japanese as he is in English?
This is impossible!
Hello everyone and welcome. This is Localization Addict. I'm Hagane, and today in Let's Talk Localization, the series where I analyze a certain game's localization work in depth, we're going to take a look at Sonic Adventure 2. I'm going to be looking at the original text, comparing it to its English localization, and showing you all the interesting things I have found in this investigation. This is the continuation of a video I made previously, so go check out my first video on Sonic Adventure if you haven't. So without further ado, let's get started. Firstly, I wanted to mention some things I noticed while making the research for this video. Immediately, what I noticed in Sonic Adventure 2 as opposed to 1 is that Japanese Sonic's random English is often kept untranslated in the localization. This is evidenced in, for example, his response to Amy when she asks him to marry him.
No way. If I tell ya, will you marry me?
No way!
Or when Eggman is stating his terms to the president.
No way!
No way!
Okay, let's move it!
Okay, let's move it!
Etc. etc. This doesn't happen all the time though. One example of an English word getting translated in a different way is as follows.
Shadow has died!
Versus at the beginning of the game, when Sonic gets caught by the military, or when Tails says versus
Tornado transformation!
when he flies to Prison Island to save Sonic. Another thing I noticed was that Dr. Eggman is consistently referred to as Dr. Eggman by everyone. It stopped being a funny nickname and became his actual name, just like in the Japanese original. And of course, all the character quirks in the characters' dialogues keep being consistent. Sonic keeps using random English words, Tails is still talking like a kid, Eggman keeps speaking in a way that fits the trope of the old man, etc. Amy keeps being more annoying in English than Japanese, as evidenced by her saying,
Wait for me, Sonic! He's such a brat sometimes.
after she helps Sonic escape Prison Island, when in the original she said, which means, Sonic, wait. Then we have a character I didn't explore in much depth during the last video, but who is equally as important as the rest, Knuckles. He speaks in a pretty crude and informal way, using demeaning words like the end particle ze, using the rude pronouns koitsu, soitsu, and aitsu, which literally mean this or that guy, but in reality have a negative connotation that is almost insulting, and using the demeaning auxiliary verb chimau. This is especially relevant to his character as he was isolated from birth from the outside world. His mission to protect the Master Emerald from such a young age, alongside the fact that the rest of the Echidna tribe was wiped off the face of the earth, meant that he didn't have a lot of socialization in his life. This in turn makes him incredibly gullible and naive, and it also affects his speech. His crude way of speaking could indicate that he wasn't taught how to interact properly with others or to humble himself in certain situations. It also goes well with his heroic nature, since in Japanese media it is very common for the male protagonist or hero of a story to use rather rude language. All in all, this way of talking fits his character like a glove. The English localization was, unfortunately, unable to cover the same undertones. However, I recognize that this is a very difficult thing, and I do think that ultimately this isn't, or at least shouldn't be, a deal breaker. Speaking of which, another thing that caught my attention was Knuckles and Rouge's relationship. In Japanese, these two act like a comedic duo of sorts. The way I see it, they have a very similar dynamic to that of manzai, which is a type of Japanese comedy characterized by having two people play different roles. One of them the role of the dumb one, or boke, and the other the straight man, or tsukomi. We can see this dynamic at play, for example, at the beginning of the game, when they're fighting for the Master Emerald. Here, we can observe an exchange that goes like this.
いい加減諦めなさいよ、しつっこい男ね。
人んちのもん盗み出しといて何言ってやがる。いいか、そのマスターエメラルドにはカオスエメラルドの暴走を止めるという重要な役目があって。うわっ、
泥棒。
そりゃお前のことだ。
Now let's take a look at the English localization for context.
Just let it go. You just don't know when to give up, do you?
What are you talking about? That emerald's mine. You got that? The Master Emerald contains special powers that neutralize the energy of the Chaos Emeralds. That makes it very powerful.
What the?
What? Thief!
Look who's calling who a thief.
To me, two things in this dialogue derive into a manzai type of comedy. The first one is Knuckles saying, "What are you talking about? That emerald is mine." And the second one is Knuckles saying, "Look who's calling who a thief." After Rouge accuses Eggman of being a thief. These two are very common types of rebuttals of the tsukkomi or straight man to do to the boke or dumb one. It's a very subtle hint, but it's there and it gives the duo a comedic effect they wouldn't have otherwise. Another thing I found interesting about this exchange is that Rouge's first line is more suggestive in Japanese than English. She's calling him a stubborn man in a way that implies a double meaning. The first one being the obvious one, that she's calling him stubborn because he won't give up on the Master Emerald. But then there's another meaning to this phrase, and that is that she's calling him stubborn as if he was trying to flirt with her. We can see the double meaning in the English localization. However, I personally feel that it's much more apparent in Japanese because of this use of the words shitsukoi otoko, which means stubborn man. This could also be a matter of how the lines are delivered in the voice acting, but since that's not the main focus of this analysis, I'll put that aside. Now let's talk about the single most beloved character in the franchise, Shadow. If you read the thumbnail of this video, you already know a little bit of what I wanted to say, but let's elaborate on that, shall we? So, the original Shadow isn't nearly as edgy as his English counterpart. This is shown by the fact that, for example, he refers to Dr. Eggman initially with the utmost respect. He uses keigo, which is Japanese polite language. I covered this in further detail in my video on keigo, but basically it is a system of politeness levels where you change the words you use to accommodate your and the other person's status within the social hierarchy. You wouldn't use the same verbs and nouns when talking to your subordinate versus your boss. For example, if I wanted to say, "My dad has sunglasses on," in informal Japanese it would be, "Otousan ga sunglasses o tsuketeiru." But in formal Japanese, this would turn into, "Chichi ga sunglasses o tsukete orimasu." Pretty different, isn't it? Well, Shadow makes use of this language, and by doing so, he is humbling himself and establishing that, in this hierarchy, Eggman is above him and thus deserving of respect. We can see examples of this in his first lines of dialogue in the game.
僕の名はシャドウ。僕を目覚めさせてくれた俺があなたの願い叶えて差し上げましょう。
He calls Dr. Eggman Anata, which is a respectful second-person pronoun, and then goes on to use the verbal phrase de plus sashiagemashou, which is in the polite volitional form, let's do X, a polite form of the auxiliary verb ageru, which means to do something for something else. In this case, Shadow is expressing that he will grant Eggman any wish he wants. This is a stark contrast to the Shadow we see in the English localization, a guy that talks to everyone in the same game. The English localization does make a very valid attempt at translating the politeness levels, though, as we can see in this scene, where Shadow calls Eggman my master.
My name is Shadow. Since you were so kind to release me, my master, I will grant you one wish.
I do realize that this kind of change in politeness level is very hard to translate into English, but the difference is still pretty noticeable. However, I would like to point out that Shadow's character is still pretty edgy in the original, just less so than the English localization. One of the telltale signs of this edginess is at the beginning of the game, when he says,
我が力とくとご覧あれ
which is a very grandiose way of essentially saying, "Behold my power." which is a pretty edgy thing to say. Another very interesting difference between the games in English and in Japanese is the word for the government organization gun or gun. In English, a gun is a type of weapon, however in Japanese, gun literally means the military. Now I don't know about you all, but I find it absolutely fascinating how the two words are similar in both languages and share similar meanings as well. It creates this parallel between the two versions where they allude to the same thing but in different ways. Unfortunately, this is not the case for other languages like Spanish, where they translated the name of the organization as if the word was originally English. I understand that sometimes things like this are purely coincidental, and as such, a language that happens not to share this word will struggle to find an alternative. However, I think it's time that companies start hiring people who can translate directly from Japanese into other languages. Who cares if it's more expensive? A multi-million-dollar company like Sega should be able to provide this service. But I digress. And of course, we can't talk about Shadow without also talking about Maria. She doesn't talk a lot in this game, however the few lines of dialogue that she has are extremely revealing. Let's give them a listen. Here we can see that Maria uses yo, a particle that is usually used to convey unknown information from one person to another, or to put emphasis on something. But in this case, she's saying this as a way to sound more feminine. She represents a very stereotypically feminine trope, and this shows in the kind of language she uses. It's also very telling how Maria uses informal language when talking to Shadow. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense, seeing as they were very good friends. She says her final goodbyes by using the Spanish word adios, which as a native Spanish speaker I always found amusing. This was translated into English as sayonara, an interesting change considering that she isn't using an English word in the original. However, I can see where they wanted to get with this change. Spanish sounds much more foreign and exotic to Japanese people than to the average English speaker. Thus, what I think the localization did here was emulate that sense of distance by using a word in a language that feels a lot less closer to the Anglosphere, Japanese. We also have the characterization of Rouge. So, in the original game, Rouge falls into the trope of the sexy onesan, a role played by an attractive woman who is old enough to be considered the same age as if they were the audience's older sister, but not old enough that they could be much older than them. This is shown in her use of the sentence-ending particle yo. She uses this, for example, when arguing with Knuckles about the Master Emerald at the beginning of the game. Here she says, which roughly means, stop messing around and give up already. Now, yo is used, just like in Maria's case, as a way for her to sound more feminine. She also uses the imperative form nasai, which is often used by people, but more commonly women, who are in a position of authority over someone else. This means that she perceives herself as being above others, and this goes very well with her personality. These were my observations and thoughts on the matter. Feel free to disagree or add something interesting I haven't mentioned in the comments down below. This has been all for today. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video and would like me to make more videos like this, hit that like button and subscribe. See you next time!